Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair, I claim time in opposition and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I am opposed to H.R. 2513, and I want to begin by outlining my opposition. This bill before us is a new small business mandate on the smallest businesses in America. The bill before us today requires some of the smallest businesses in America, those with fewer than 20 employees and those with less than $5 million in receipts, to file annually a list of all their owners with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. For those that are watching on C-SPAN, trivia question for them, Mr. Chair. I bet most of them have never heard of FinCEN. I bet those in the House office buildings, Mr. Chair, have not heard of FinCEN. Now, it's a little-known agency even here in Washington that deal with financial crimes in the Treasury Department. Now imagine you're a small business owner, you're getting a notice from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to mandate that you disclose the owners of your entity. So this would be the first first consumer-facing intelligence bureau that we'd have in the federal government. This bill would require small business owners and small business investors to submit their personal information to a new federal database without adequate privacy protections. This new federal database would be accessible to law enforcement without a warrant, without a subpoena, a disturbing violation of due process in my view. This has the fewest civil liberties protections of any federal intelligence bureau database. It's a lower standard of accountability than what Congress provides in the Patriot Act, which largely targets foreign actors. According to the National Federation of Independent Businesses, this bill would also add more than $5.7 billion in new regulatory costs for America's small businesses. Supporters of the bill are calling for these changes without any direct evidence to justify the mandate. Plenty of anecdote, but no data. For several months leading up to the committee's consideration of this bill, I sought data from the intelligence bureau called FinCEN and from the Treasury Department, along with the Department of Justice, to better understand the need for this legislation. They provided none. They gave anecdote of very scary stories to try to compel me as a legislator to vote for what is a very specific threshold in law and a very specific new small business mandate. I refuse to legislate based off of anecdote. I'd like to have hard data. My questions have not been answered by FinCEN, the Treasury Department, or the Department of Justice. We have no information on how beneficial ownership information will be protected in addition to that. We do not have information on how the privacy of small businesses will be preserved. In fact, we have an amendment here considered on the House floor that could further expose their data to the public. So even that determination is not in stone now with the bill before us. We don't have information on how many law enforcement agencies will have access to the database, how many financial institutions will have access to the database, or what threshold for amount of sales and the number of employees will yield the most effective outcome. So in the bill we have $5 million of revenue and under, and 20 employees and under. We have no data to back up that that's the right threshold for either the dollar amount or the number of employees. Now we'll have stories, and we'll have members come to the House floor telling us stories of bad actors. But that is anecdote. That is not data to provide for this threshold. And if we're going to have such an encroachment on America's personal, identifiable information of small businesses across this country, shouldn't we have solid data? Shouldn't we have solid data? I believe so. And I believe we have a number of issues that need to be dealt with to make this bill sustainable and provide protections for civil liberties. I believe that combating illicit finance is a nonpartisan issue that all members want to address. Our actions must be thoughtful and data-driven. For example, in committee, we came together in support of H.R. 2514, the Counter Act, introduced by the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, and the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers. H.R. 2514 is a compilation of bipartisan policies to modernize and reform the Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering regimes. It balances security and privacy. I think we've got a nice bipartisan bill that was reported out of committee without a dissenting vote. It provides the Treasury Department and other federal agencies with the resources they need to help catch bad actors. There's been years of work in the production of that bill that is wrapped up in this larger bill. I'm disappointed that the Counter Act is not being considered as a standalone bill, instead being swept into this bill, because I believe as a standalone bill, we could get that bill through the House, through the Senate, and signed by the President into law this year. So I think it's unfortunate that we're not considering that as a standalone measure. I want to thank my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for listening to some of our concerns on the Republican side of the aisle. We will have some Republican members that vote for this bill. I, however, will not. The encroachment on the question of civil liberties, the lack of separation of powers, the lack of the use of a subpoena, and the lack of regulatory relief for those that are collecting this data, both in terms of small businesses and financial institutions, has not been fixed nor dealt with. In particular, the Rules Committee last night rejected amendments that would require law enforcement to obtain a subpoena before accessing, during committee, there was a rejection of a subpoena in our discussions. And then last night, the Rules Committee rejected my amendment that would provide greater certainty for small businesses and for community banks by repealing the customer due diligence rule, which requires financial institutions to collect similar data that is being required in this bill. So I believe that issue still merits a more thoughtful solution and that doesn't treat legitimate small businesses as collateral damage like the current bill does. So with that, I am opposed to the bill and would retain the balance of my time.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves